Hi. In a previous video, I demoed you how reasoning from the first principles can significantly improve your interview skills. Okay, in this video, I'm going to show you how using analogies and reasoning by analogies and critical thinking in general can help you craft your own best stories. And I'm going to use 5 examples to demonstrate this. Okay, so first example, that probably a simple, straightforward one, would be the star format. Okay, so if we take the following example, at company X, I was working as senior analyst. This would be the situation, and the task was, as the business grew, a manual process had to be automated. And the action I took was using Dr. Google and Professor YouTube. I built a VBA script, and the result was what used to take hours now took only seconds. Okay, so if I demonstrate this example to you for showcasing the star format, I believe it's well understood that how you should use this example to structure your own stories in the star format. Okay, nothing complicated so far. Okay, now if we enrich this simple star example and add some learnings. This project was full of learnings, such as to learn how algorithms work, the VBA language, and some coding skills which serve me even today. Okay, so if I present this star with learnings example, what happens is that a good number of candidates would automatically deduce that they should also use learnings throughout their story bank, so this type of analogy doesn't really make sense. Okay, so notice how the first example of a star answer makes perfect sense for most candidates, whereas if I enrich a little bit the format, if I add a bit of complexity, some people would already struggle reasoning by analogy and using critical thinking to determine that, hey, some of my answers could use some learnings, but not all my answers could use learnings. Okay, the second example I like to talk about here would be with respect to the length, the ideal length of an interview answer. Okay, so people with good reasoning by analogy will understand how to use examples, how to use short, concise examples or deep dives to their advantage. Okay, so you would be able to reason clearly by analogy if I show you a deep example, because probably the main point was there that I went through a deep dive because I wanted to showcase some technical expertise in that example. On the other hand, people with not so good reasoning by analogy will decide that, hey, if Dan showcased a deep dive in that example of when, dealing with ambiguous situations, I would always want to showcase a deep dive while dealing with ambiguous situations, right? So notice the difference. The good reasoning, to adapt the length of your answer with respect to what you're after, versus the questionable reasoning, the length of the answer is something set in stone. Okay, this was the second example. The third example I'd like to demo you here just quickly would be a role applicability. Okay, so simply put, what applies to one role might not apply to all roles. And an example I like giving here is that to showcase you as a subject matter expert in whatever you do, you might want to use frameworks, to sell yourself on frameworks. Right, you're proficient using some framework to achieve a goal. For example, a PM role would be using the Moscow prioritization model to prioritize tasks, requirements, or features in project management or software development. Okay, so if I demonstrate to you an example where a PM uses the Moscow prioritization model, this should serve as a reference point that it is a good idea for you to consider using frameworks in your interview answers. But some people with some questionable reasoning would take this advice, would stretch this advice as far as, hey, I should use the Moscow prioritization model in my answers. Whereas if you take this advice literally, I've even seen salespeople literally import the Moscow prioritization model in their answers, which makes no sense or makes little sense. Okay, so again, the difference between good reasoning and questionable reasoning here with respect to role applicability in this case. Okay, example number 4, with respect to stretching a little bit the limits of what you can say in job interviews. Okay, so for example, sometimes I give examples which stretch a little bit the limits of interviewing. For if I ask you, why do you want to work for this company? A possible answer could be, hey, I'm not sure I want to join you as of yet. I'm just here to learn more about the opportunity and to see what type of experiences make sense for us both. Okay, so a candidate with good reasoning and good critical thinking would understand that this is an edge scenario. Maybe it is, maybe it's not something you may use. Maybe you'd want to use another type of edge scenario while answering why this company. Someone with poor critical thinking and poor reasoning by analogy would literally use this example or this type of answer, I'm not sure I want to join you as of yet, regardless of where they apply, regardless of their situation, regardless if they can afford it or not. Okay, so this is, stretching the limits and how reasoning by analogy and critical thinking skills could makes the difference between a good and versus a bad candidate. Okay, and example number 5 here I want to talk about would be understanding how to pitch a core behavior. Okay, and use a core behavior and pitch it to your own benefit. Okay, and an example I have here is, how did you handle a conflict with a peer? Okay, so handling conflict situations. And basically, the way to handle conflict in most situations would be that you would use your subject matter expertise to eventually look at the data, find out some data, find some reasoning, some critical thinking skills to prove your point, and of course, to also listen to the other side as to what they were saying, and eventually, try to reach a settlement here. We'll try to see what's the best course of action. Okay, in a conflict resolution scheme. Okay, now someone with good critical thinking skills and someone who is able to reason by analogy well, would the main takeaway from handling a conflict situation would be, hey, yes, I would use 2 things: my ability to resolve conflict through to use a functional conflict where I use my expertise, and to listen to the other part as 2 key elements in resolving the conflict as a behavior. Right, so this would be the systems thinking you would use to handle conflict. Someone with questionable critical thinking skills, someone who's not really able to reason by analogy, would literally take the example, modify the position title, say, yes, this is a great example, sounds great, I think it would fit perfectly in my role. Okay, so in conclusion here, in a similar way that the first principles reasoning helps you to focus on clarity of thought versus structure, for example, or to understand why a question gets asked versus just answering questions reactively during job interviews, I noticed that candidates who exhibit this unique critical thinking and therefore reasoning by analogy tend to perform significantly better in job interviews with high-performing companies. So I hope you found this advice useful, and thank you very much for watching.